How you guys doing? All 12 of you here, I think. It won't bother me if you move closer to the middle here with this tonight, so you feel free to do that. We're just glad that you're here. We appreciate very much your presence, and we welcome each one of you. Any of us who have to deal with everyday life, whether we go home tonight and watch TV, whether we've heard the news today, whether we work around neighbors who are good people, living their lives just fine and all of that, but have no interest at all in the Lord or the Lord's ways or what comes after this. Any of you who have to deal with the general philosophies of education when your children go to school now, or any of you in any way who ever have to find yourself in the middle of your life wondering whether you've ever done any good or what it's all going to amount to, can identify in some way with the question that arises in Ecclesiastes. What do people gain from all their toil? You do agree with this guy, this writer, don't you? That people are engaged in all kinds of toil in one way or another. The people, all people have various kinds of activities that put pressure on them or cause them stress or keep them occupied or make them concerned about what's going on. If you ever talk to any of your neighbors who are classified as the unchurched, and if you ever have to try to have a point of contact with them where you can begin a discussion of spiritual things, this is where you're going to have to start in America right now. You can't just start with whether they believe in a God. I wish it weren't that way, but I think it is, and I think this is why people will think that they need not, or we need not ever even wonder about such things. And so we have the benefit of a book in the Bible where the writer gathers together all wisdom as if all you can know or all you can find is what you can see in people's experience, that you're going to be able to make sense out of your whole journey by just looking at what people experience. And so all through this book, up until the very end, after after verse 8 of chapter 12, finally relationship to God gets mentioned. All through this book, only the name of the mighty God, only the Elohim, only the basic word for God is used. Never the Lord God, or never the covenant God, never the God who makes his name known and chooses a people for himself and relates to them on the basis of a covenant. Never that God. It's just people and their endeavors and what people go through and then what happens. And so in this book already, we've seen him look in education and in work and in pleasure and in power, and we found out that he still finds himself empty because he comes head on to the fact that one event happens to everybody, rich or poor, famous or not, pleasure, enjoying the pleasures or not. And that's the circumstances. So in light of all of that, how's a person supposed to enjoy life? How's a person supposed to deal with the rising suicide rates in Western life right now? How's a person supposed to deal with people who seem to have everything but just think that nothing is worth it? How do you deal with the emptiness and the loneliness of life? All of that seems a bit dreary, doesn't it? And that's not really, though, the message of this book. The message of this book is it does not have to be that way. We don't have to keep spinning our wheels looking and under all the same rocks people have always looked under and destroyed themselves. There's a better answer than that. So if I ask you to start with, have you been enjoying your life this week? I'm not getting much of a commitment from you guys about that. If there were anything, Leona's nodding. I found her out here planting flowers yesterday. I know she's enjoying her life. If there were any things that kept you from enjoying life, what would they be? Any information, any experience, any task, any problems, anything kept you from really just being able just to relax and enjoy what God has given you to do this week? Have there been any of those things? Could you identify them, any of them? I'm not going to ask you to say them out loud, but it's interesting to try to examine that. So in this chapter tonight, you notice the title I've given it, Enjoy. Have you seen what I've been seeing? That's kind of the way I take Ecclesiastes chapter 4. And I definitely think this is a chapter where we need to establish a few landmarks before we start reading our way through it, or we're liable to misunderstand what the writer of this book is saying here. Because if we don't do this part well, it's going to sound like he is suggesting it's not worth it, you just wish to put an end to it. That is not what he's saying. But he is dealing with something that Western man ought to think about. And I think we can establish a few landmarks. So let's do that to start with. Notice where we left off in verse 22 of chapter 3, where we were last time. Remember, after he had dealt with all the problems that time introduces into our experience, he said, I saw that there's nothing better than that all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot. This is an NRSV I'm reading here. So there's nothing better than that all should enjoy their work. If you can work and do some good and then enjoy it, then he's saying that's as good as it gets. Without God, it would be. Now, that's the first landmark. The second one, as we work our way into chapter 4, is that familiar phrase we've run across. It's at the end of verse 3, under the sun. Now, that phrase establishes the perspective from which he is examining all of the information he's been able to gather. Remember that Ecclesiastes means together. So the teacher has been gathering. So under the sun means what in this letter, in your own words? What's he telling us about his search? What's his perspective? A worldly point of view. All right, he's looking at things just based on what he can see in this world without any information from God, from heaven, or from above the sun, we might say. Third landmark in this book, in this chapter, as we work our way through, is the fact that all throughout chapter 4, there is one being who is not even mentioned. Who is it? God. God is, and again, it's not his covenant name, but God's mentioned many times in this book, but significantly not in chapter 4. And that has a big bearing on the tone of what he's going to say. The fourth landmark here is that his method in this chapter is in pairs, by contrasting twos, I've said it here. Sometimes he'll use the word two, sometimes he'll use both, the word both. Sometimes he'll just show the contrast between two parties in some sort of relationship. Sometimes he'll just say two's better than one. And he's always contrasting circumstances in life here, not persons. The fifth thing is in this chapter, there is a cluster of betters, or a series of betters. So he's going to be saying here, I looked at what goes on and what keeps people from enjoying things, and just by the contrast in what I see, even I can recognize that there are some things that are better than other things in terms of how life should be used or how life should be lived. So we take some clues from him in that way. So I'm hoping you have your Bible open, follow along here now. And I want to just suggest at this point that there is a theme, an identifiable theme in Ecclesiastes 4 that I think we can state so that we can get a handle on it. This is like a handle on the pot here, the skillet. The theme is trying to make sense of things that keep us from being able to enjoy life. When we look at the world around us like he's doing, and we see things that are just not right, not fair, it's not how it ought to be, then how do we make sense of those things? That's what he's going to be talking to us about here. So we'll start now reading our way through. There are four of these things that he deals with. The first one is oppressions. What do you think of when I use the word oppression? What is oppression typically? Pardon? It's interesting that we think of it as it happening to us. What is it if it's being done? It is keeping somebody, beating somebody down, or taking advantage. Oppression is unfairness. Oppression is injustice. Oppression is profiting by using other people. It is cheating, defrauding, robbing, abusing, taking advantage of, exercising control over. That's oppression. Where is it possible for oppression to exist? Any relationship that involves persons. It can be a boss to a worker. It can be a ruler toward a citizen. It can be a family member toward another family member. It can be one age group versus another, one race versus another, etc., etc. Is this something that only existed in the world of 950 BC? No, it's been pretty much present wherever there's been human beings, as far as I can tell. Does it look different to you? Do you agree with that pretty much? Oppression is a human problem. How upset does it make people? Well, that depends on whether you're the one doing it or the one having it happening to you. A lot of people are quite satisfied with oppression. A lot of people are not. In our world now, a lot of times we are oppressing each other over oppression that happened centuries ago. That's an odd thing. We got enough in our own time to worry about. And you notice a lot of times the world's answer to these things is for those who have been oppressed to get even. Find somebody to oppress. That's sort of how we go about it. So let's read a paragraph at a time. I want to break it into 4 paragraphs here. Chapter 4, verse 1, these are the first 3 verses. Again I saw, and generally speaking, I saw is going to tell us the subject matter in these paragraphs. Again I saw all the oppressions that are practiced under the sun. Look, or behold, the tears of the oppressed, with no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who have already died more fortunate than the living who are still alive, but better than both is the one who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are under the sun. Notice the I saw at the start of verse 1, and then the has not seen what I've seen at the end of verse 3. So look at his points here. First off, notice in the first verse there are the tears of the one and the power of the other. The tears of the oppressed and the power that's with the oppressors. The one who controls the other, and then this one over here is beaten down by all of that. And he sees that going on endlessly. It's always occurring. It's always present. And it wears him out. It breaks his heart. And what is it that he sees is especially the problem here that really bothers him? What does he say twice in what I've just read? With no one to comfort. That's right. What does that suggest to you? There is the oppression, and then there is the inhumanity. There's the injustice, and then the inhumanity. The injustice done, the inhumanity, which is unable to care about it or unable to try to get involved or to try to comfort or to let it go on or to take it as normal. And then the writer says, when I saw all of that and I thought about it long enough, I considered that it was better to never even have lived to see the injustices. It is so bitter to him. Now, if you're not careful, reading verse 3 there, 2 and 3, if you're not careful, if I'm not careful, I want to take it that he's saying it's better to have never lived. But notice the contrast is not between living and never have lived. The contrast is between seeing this kind of injustice and never have lived to see it. What he's saying is not that it's better to have never lived, but that life is a bitter experience with injustice and inhumanity going on. And at least you can say that this writer, in trying to investigate life and to try to make sense of it and trying to gather the wisdom enough, at least he's involved enough to recognize what it does to people and to think over. I can't just sit here and say I've lived a long and happy life and I'm going to heaven while all this is going on. And so he said what he's telling us again is under the sun, if this is all there is, and if this is what goes on in all there is, then I wish I envy the ones who never even lived. Now, to balance this out, I want us to back up for a minute, up in verse 16 of chapter 3. And you'll remember us reading this last week, these two verses, 16 and 17. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, wickedness was there as well. And I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for he has appointed a time for every matter and for every work. So there will be a judgment, but it exists in whose time? God's time. Now, down here in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, whose time is the guy looking at? He's living in his time. And in his time, the justice hasn't happened yet. That's what he's saying. And furthermore, see, if this man's time is all that there's ever going to be, when will there be justice? I'm talking about full, complete justice. Never. So wherever the justice of man is concerned, There are influences that are capable of making it lean one way or the other, no matter what we say about it. We know that that's true. Now, for example, last night I heard, not to delve in too far the political stuff, but I heard something that sort of really surprised me. I mean, typically in American life, if you named off a bunch of the defense manufacturers, the industrial military complex, the people who make the planes and the ammunition and the rockets and all those kind of things, and you think about the money that they would spend on lobbying and so forth, you would think there are people who are influencing. I heard last night that Facebook and Amazon spent more in lobbying than all of those other companies put together. I don't know if it's last year or during the last election cycle, but makes you think, doesn't it? The influencers are not always the ones we think, and yet they're always present trying to gain an edge or leverage or some sort. And this fellow is weary of that. And if it's just his time, that's how it is. All right, let's move on here. Next section, the next problem that keeps him from really being able to enjoy his work is all the things that are done, all the toil and the work that's motivated by one person's envy or rivalry or competition with another person. Now, he's not talking here about the competition between the Dodgers and the Cardinals. He's not talking between the competition that causes one company to try to produce a better product or so forth. He's talking about the envy of one person against another and what people will do to try to have more or to be more or to look better or so forth than their neighbor. He says, "Then I saw all the toil and all the skill in work that come from one person's envy of another. This also is vanity and a chasing after wind." I'll read these one verse at a time here. Here is the toil and the skill in work that come from one person's envy of the other person. The one person just wanting to be ahead of the other person. The one person who just can't be satisfied while the other person is the least bit ahead of him in any kind of way. That it's not saying you shouldn't try to do your best. It's saying let your efforts be motivated from who you are and what you can do instead of looking over there at your neighbor. That's what he's getting at. And what happens to you if you toil and you work looking over at your neighbor? What do you always find? Somebody who has a little more or does a little better than you. And what do you always think? It's not fair. It's not fair. That should have been mine. You know, it's not. That's how we think. So that's what he's saying. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's the opposite way in which envy can work itself. Fools fold their hands and consume their own flesh. Is it possible to be idle or lazy out of envy? Is it? Yes, it is. It's possible to say it's not right for him to have any more than me or to get any farther than I get, so I'll just not as well even try. And so now we have not the one who wears himself out with work or toil and skill. Now we have the one who folds his hands and does absolutely nothing, just inactive. He doesn't try at all. I noticed in Proverbs when it talks about the sluggard in Proverbs 6, and I noticed this version I ran across that translates it not sluggard but the lazy bones. That sounds like an American translation, doesn't it? So in Proverbs 6 verses 10 and 11, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior. That's what he's saying. So he's looking at human experience, and he says, on the one hand, there's oppression. On another hand here, there's all this anxious labor and toil. It's just out of envy, and if it's not that, it's complete laziness and irresponsibility, just out of ill will toward the other person. And so what he says then is in verse 6, better is a handful with quiet than 2 handfuls with toil and a chasing after wind. Now there is a healthy balance. Here's what I mean. How did that one hand get full? Better is a handful, so how did the handful get there? All right, work. The person did something. The person got hold of something. You see, that's the idea. Now, this handful with quiet means, after his toil, he can rest, which is what the writer was telling us back up in chapter 2, verse 24. There's nothing better than this, to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. If you have a handful and you can be quiet with it, content with it, that's what he said. That's the good. So it's better to have that than 2 handfuls with toil and a chasing after wind, meaning you can't use it, you can't enjoy it, you can't keep it. Why can't you keep it? Because you got to worry about the fact that you're not permanent, and neither is the it you have in your hands. So there's the idea. So this is, again, a thought that the Proverbs bring up many a time, especially I notice chapters 15 and 16. In Proverbs 15, at verse 16, the wisdom said, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. And the next verse, verse 17 of Proverbs 15 said, better is a dinner of vegetables where love is than a fatted ox and hatred with it. Pot roast with anger and jealousy and anxiety will give you heartburn. And in chapter 16 in verse 8 of the Proverbs, it said, better is a little with righteousness than large income with injustice. Boy, there's a lot of wisdom in that. And that's what the writer is getting at here. So that's the second problem that he sees. First, the injustices. Second, the envious either labor or laziness that takes over in people's life. And then the third problem that's here. Look on to verse 7 and following now. This is a longer paragraph in my judgment, verses 7 through 12. And the problem here is all who are without a second. And I don't mean a second of time. I should have put second in quotes to show what I'm getting at. Second is the literal translation, or the literal word that may be translated those who are the ones who have one who has no other, or one who is without a dependent or without a companion. This person is completely alone with no relationships or no connections. No friends, no people who are important enough to him to either share or to help with his work and toil. And so here's what the writer says. Again, verse 7, I saw vanity under the sun. Look at the perspective now again. The case of solitary individuals or persons without a second, without sons or brothers, yet there is no end to all their toil, and their eyes are never satisfied with riches. Let's stop there for a second and see what he's saying. Now, we've already established they're not going to be here forever, and that 2 handfuls with labor and toil are just a chasing after a wind, and yet here is somebody still wearing himself out in the grind of all of that without another person to whom it means anything. There's no end to the toil, meaning there's no rest, and the eyes are never satisfied, which means there's no contentment. Just in life under the sun, because every day brings its own list of things that have to be worried about or done. And so then he says, they ask, sooner or later, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. Some of the versions say a miserable business. To be purposeless and to be engaged in purposeless activity is vanity and unhappy business. And that leads to the third better now in this chapter. 2 are better than 1. That illustration is there. And then this section ends at the end of verse 12 with a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. This is a rope that is woven together out of 3 cords, and it's not quickly broken. It's stronger, and it gets more, it lasts longer and gets more accomplished in that way. So, and then he lists 4 reasons. By the way, I found a quote, our young friend Luke Dockery, in something he wrote, and I think he said it's a Swedish proverb. I don't know much Swedish, but if it's this wise, it's good. Shared joy is a double joy. Shared sorrow is half a sorrow. That's a good way to say 2 are better than 1. Shared joy is a double joy. Shared sorrow is half a sorrow. I asked Travis to read in our scripture reading a while ago from Philippians 4:10 through 14. Go back and read that after class with that little proverb I just mentioned in your mind and think about that paragraph that way. All right, here are the reasons 2 are better than 1. First off, the encouragement that comes, the accomplishment that comes from cooperation, because they have a good reward for their toil, meaning they get more done. They do more good. When Jesus got ready to send out his disciples, how'd he send them? 2 by 2. Why did he do that? Did he think 2 are better than 1? In some way he must have. All right, next. Verse 10, they can assist each other, support each other. He says, for if they fall, one will lift up the other. But woe to him who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. I've known a case or two in my time, even with the congregation here, where we've had people we've loved who fell and could not get up. There was nobody there. And I could tell some of the stories. A time or two, somebody's had to lift me up to a window to holler through to see if whoever was in there needed help. And in one case, the person said yes. So 2 are better than 1. Then Third, verse 11. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. Without being too personal, you all know that I'm one of 9 children. Do you know how we slept when we were little boys? 3 of us in a bed. And it wasn't altogether just to have space. It was partly to be able to keep warm. And the traveling people of that day and age and so forth, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? In verse 12, then the fourth, protection, safety. And though one might prevail against another, 2 will withstand 1. Now, remember that what he is arguing, that just from the under the sun point of view, where the autonomous person and what he wants to do and what he's getting done is all that matters. That's how people live. But you can't deny the wisdom of what he's saying here, even from the under the sun point of view. Now, if you introduce God into the picture, what does God call us to be? Solitary individuals in his family, or brothers and sisters in his family? Who does God tell us to love besides himself? Our neighbors as ourselves. So it's this principle from God's point of view in that way. While I was working on this today, I ran across an old poem, and this was written years ago, but think of this. Oh, the comfort, the inexpressible comfort of feeling safe with a person, having neither to weigh thoughts nor measure words, but pouring them all right out just as they are, chaff and grain together, certain that a faithful hand will take and sift them, keep what's worth keeping, and with the breath of kindness blow the rest away. It's a little poem titled Friendship, and I think that's what this writer is longing for when he writes what he does here. Now, if this was Solomon, which is the traditional view of this, I kind of question it myself, but he's a guy has 300 wives and 700 concubines. So you got to be talking about healthy relationships here and not just people around for this principle to work. All right, quickly here. Chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. The fourth problem is that all the grasping for fleeting power that goes on in the world around. You got to admit, this is the source of a whole lot of dissatisfaction and pained hearts in our lives together. The constant, when does one campaign start? When does a new campaign start? The minute the other one's over or before. The kind of jockeying for position and so forth starts. So the minute the person or persons are sworn in, or just when they're even announced as having won an election, it's immediately clear to everybody that they're fleeting, it won't last. And that's the part of this that he deals with next here. Verse 13, better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who will no longer take advice. How did the latter king get old? And how did he get unable to take advice? by having been in power and by having heard advice. And it got to where he couldn't anymore. And how much future did he have then? He had a history but no future. So better is a poor but wise youth who can take advice. That's what he says. All right, now next, he uses an example that maybe he had seen or personally witnessed, or maybe it's just an illustration. One can indeed come out of prison to reign, even though born poor in the kingdom. I saw all the living who moving about under the sun follow that youth who replaced the king. There was no end to all those people whom he led. So he's just saying that old king might need to remember that just having been in power does not necessarily make you into some great something, because there can be a youth in prison who might be the next person who comes to power. No comment about anybody's history who is in power here, but just think about that. Being in power does not testify to any personal greatness necessarily. That's what he's saying here. And that leads to the third observation. He says, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Even that fellow, the young guy who was in prison and got out of prison and rose to power and was famous and had a great following, it'll come a time when people are no longer impressed with him, don't rejoice in him, because that happens to everybody. I've remembered ever since my college days something that a verse I heard Joe Barnett quote. He said it was 2 Babylonians 7:14. It is not given any man to ring every man's bell, he said. And you could add to that, you could say the second part of that verse is that nobody will ring anybody's bell forever. So power does not last. And he is, if this was the king who had ruled a long time, and if he could witness Jeroboam and Rehoboam jockeying for power before his death, wouldn't that be some thought? Maybe that's what he's talking about. What difference would it have made if God had been in these four pictures, either with the oppressing or all the envious toil, or with the ones who were without another with them, or those who are grasping for power? What difference would living in relation to the Lord have made in each one of those scenes? Injustice, for example. It's unjust for the bell to ring before I'm finished. Okay. We'll have to quit, but injustice, if you knew you're going to give account to God, you would care about that like he does. The anxious toil, you would learn to stop and give thanks and to share and to enjoy, to want to do your best. The two better than one, you'd want to make friends and build relationships because you're made in God's image. And then the last one about power, mostly you'd want to humble yourself before his power. That would make a huge difference in life. I sure appreciate getting to read this book with you guys. And thank you for being with us tonight. And let's finish with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for these dear people. Please bless us all as we try to live our lives gratefully with a view from above the sun that we're privileged to have because you've made yourself known to us in your word, and because of your promises and because of Christ. Help us to live among your people with a kind of joy that overcomes the obstacles to joy that we have been observing in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Please be with all these sweet people this week. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everybody.